maintain and support legacy systems.
Well, the appropriation earmarks what the funding would be for, and within the separate appropriations and allocations, I think that we could cover that. Also, in terms of efficiency and IT efficiency, it should be noted that filing season 2019, we set records for processing per second, per hour, and per minute, and we broke those records in filing season 20 during the COVID pandemic, with most of our facilities shut down. And we came to 2.275 million returns processed per hour, 632 per second, without any technological errors. And the same group of IT folks who handled our filing season were also responsible for implementing the EIP payments, which was not only for individuals that we had information, but individuals we did not have information. And then we inherited the programming for the Veterans Administration as well as for Social Security Administration, and we created portals that more than 14 million people came in through a non-filers portal. Our same IT folks took care of all of that at the same time. We did not have a luxury of onboarding hundreds or thousands of folks to help us in that situation. We had people who had to multitask. And these particular folks worked 15 to 17-hour days, 7 days a week from March through July. And I would say that our folks performed. I would suggest and request on an IT appropriation oversight, specific appropriations for where we are. The Taxpayer First Act was passed, strong bipartisan support, has tremendous provisions in it for modernizing the systems of the Internal Revenue Service, but it does not yet have any funding associated with it. So, in my mindset, these things come together. We take our responsibilities to Congress, to the American people, and to our employees and the neighborhoods that our employees live very seriously. We want to perform, and we want people to be proud of the Internal Revenue Service.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, it was a great answer, but I don't believe it fully answered my question, but I know my time has expired. So
I'm available for all of you on a one-on-one.
Let me just say, Mr. Heiss, I think maybe implicit in your line of questioning is, despite the accomplishments of the IRS under very adverse circumstances, remember that we also represent the community. Mm-hmm. And I think Mr. Heiss is pointing out, and I certainly joining him, I gave some examples in my opening remarks. We're hearing from constituents who aren't being well served, who are panicking in some cases about their refunds or their direct payments still. And we need a better response, frankly, in terms of liaison with members of Congress to be able to serve those taxpayers, our constituents. And I hope you're hearing that, because generally we hear from people when things aren't working. So that may be a small percentage, but it's real human beings and real need. So I echo what my friend Mr. Heiss has said. We need to really work on that, and I think, frankly, having a stepped-up liaison for us to be able to go to some kind of ombudsman who can help solve problems for taxpayers would be very welcome under these.
May I provide a brief comment?
Yes, of course.
In conjunction with that, we had a phone line for Congress that got essentially overrun with the volume. So we're sensitive and understanding. And then it was my bright idea to create an email box such that our folks could work it around the clock on emails received. We received, I think, over 100,000 emails from a House.gov or Senate.gov. And so my bright idea really overran us as well, but it was an effort to try to get there. Sir, I spent 36 years on the outside representing individuals with respect to the Internal Revenue Service and tax-related matters. I very much understand the concepts that each of you are there. I take these concepts to heart. And there have been some comments with respect to lower income individuals as well as different ethnic communities. And I've not been in front of many of you before, but I want to add into this 2 points that I'm very proud, and I'm closing here, but 2 points that I'm very proud. I am the first commissioner in the history of the Internal Revenue Service whose spouse came into the United States as a refugee from a refugee camp, and whose parents do not speak English but happen to now live in the United States. I'm also the first commissioner to come to the Internal Revenue Service who has a son or daughter who is active duty United States military, who has deployed twice, who has the privilege of wearing the flag on his shoulder, and I take that to heart. Those are the issues as to why I came on board.
Thank you, Mr. Reddick, and we certainly honor your personal history and commitment. Remember, members of Congress are also patriots and committed to their constituents and trying to make things work under very adverse circumstances. And thank you, Mr. Heiss, for allowing me to piggyback on that. The chair now calls on the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, terrific. Thanks for the hearing. Mr. Reddick, Commissioner Reddick, I want to give you credit because you're certainly putting a brave face on in view of these dramatic cuts that the IRS has experienced over a period of years now. I mean, the numbers are breathtaking. The workforce having been reduced by 22% since 2010 has obviously undercut the IRS's daily operations in a significant way. And I want to salute the frontline workers at the IRS, the rank and file, who are really engaged in acts of heroism every day, trying to lift up a caseload that I think is drowning them. So we have to get more resources to the IRS, and that has to be a number one priority for Congress, and I think it ought to be a priority of any administration. Unfortunately, we have not seen that from the Trump administration. When the IRS doesn't have enough resources, the fact of the matter is that the rich get richer, high-end tax cheats get away with not paying their taxes, fraudsters are able to get away with their schemes, and those who ought to be on the receiving end of severe and significant enforcement by the IRS are not. Meanwhile, those average Americans out there who play by the rules and look to the IRS to engage with them in a straightforward way and get them their refunds, make sure the earned income tax credit is processed, make sure that these economic payments that come from these stimulus measures we put in place are getting to them. They're the ones that are getting short shrift here. So I think that's what's so offensive to many of us is when the IRS doesn't have the resources that it should, it can't do what's necessary to enforce against those who are trying to evade their tax obligations on the one hand, and it can't provide the kind of service to everyday Americans who are playing by the rules on the other hand. Ms. Collins, can you talk a little bit more with us about how adequate funding around enforcement can actually pay huge dividends for the IRS and clamp down on the kinds of schemes and efforts to avoid tax payment that we know are going on out there every single day? Put some numbers behind that for us.
Well, sure. As we all know that our U.S. tax system is a voluntary tax system, and we depend on people willing every year to sit down, fill out that form, and pay their appropriate amount of taxes. So I really think enforcement is a reward to those who voluntarily comply. And I think if the public does not see that the IRS is enforcing the laws, we're going to be at risk of losing people continuing to voluntarily comply.
Well, I appreciate that because, you know, sometimes those who want to attack the IRS on ideological grounds, they sort of say, you know, be afraid, the tax man cometh. But when the IRS is coming for those who aren't paying their taxes, aren't playing by the rules, that's the appropriate kind of enforcement. And the resources that you can garner if you do that enforcement well can then be redeployed again, to help serve those taxpayers out there that are playing by the rules, are looking for that refund, are looking for the benefits that can come when we use the IRS to distribute important stimulus payments in the midst of a pandemic like we're doing right now. So that's the trade-off we see. And we have an obligation to make sure that the IRS is funded in a way that it can do its job and do its job on behalf of that broad set of Americans that rely on this agency to make sure resources get distributed in a fair fashion. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for this hearing. It I think, emphasizes once again why we as a committee, why Congress needs to work hard to get the resources to this agency, but also why we need leadership from the top. And I'm not talking about Commissioner Reddick right now. I'm talking about the President of the United States, who understands the valuable service that the IRS can provide. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Grothman, the gentleman from Wisconsin, is now recognized for his 5 minutes. Mr. Grothman, I see you.
Yep, there we are.
There you go.
Now you hear me? Okay. Good.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Reddick for being here. I think his agency is professional, and I think any implication that they are intentionally avoiding segments of the population, as it so frequently is misplaced and insulting. That be that as it said, it's not a perfect agency, so we have some questions for you. In Wisconsin, we had a lot of people who couldn't get their tax refunds. And at least we were informed part of the problem was that they had shut down the Fresno office. Now that's unrelated, as far as I can see, to the quality of IT. It's just a decision to apparently have a lot of tax returns sitting there unopened, and as the result, people waiting, months for their tax refunds. Maybe some still don't have. I wondered if you could comment on the decision to shut down the Fresno Center and what was or is being done to make sure that people were getting their tax refunds. After all, here we have money that people really already worked for and are waiting to have come. And is it your belief that right now all or almost all of the refunds that wound up in the Fresno Center are paid off?
Well, the Fresno Service Center is scheduled for a closing. We've closed 2 other centers, and I think there's 2 others beyond that. That's actually part of a consolidation that's been going on for the Internal Revenue Service for years as paper filings were reduced and electronic filings increased. And our current statistic on electronic filings is almost 92%. So it used to be 92%, let's say, in paper filings. So we had campuses around the country, some dedicated to individual returns, some dedicated to business returns. So the concept that Fresno would be in the process of closing, and it's about a year project from now, and we are working, you should know, very hard for the placement of our employees elsewhere within the Internal Revenue Service, and we're also working with the private sector doing career days to place our folks on the outside. We are one family. But in terms of the,
Can you hear me?
I'm sorry, yes.
Yeah, I don't think you get the gist of the question. The problem is we are told that returns were sent to the Fresno office. And whether it was your decision or the governor of California, I don't know. But after returns were sent to the Fresno office, they were never opened and sat there. It's not a matter of the long-term decision to shut down the Fresno office. I was told that the Fresno office was, as a practical matter, not working at all due to the coronavirus, and therefore people who sent tax returns there were not getting their refunds, and they just remained there unopened. Is that accurate? And if so, is the office now up and running, or what has become of the refunds for people whose paper returns were sent to Fresno?
So it was my decision to close almost 90% of our 511 facilities around the country based on health and safety concerns for our employees. We did it procedurally with respect to local guidance, although we were exempt from guidance, but during March, April, May, our physical facilities were shut down. So Mail did create a backlog during that period of time. We have been working on that backlog, and I indicated earlier a belief that we're within a couple of million paper returns inside of a backlog, which is also why we would stress for people who have yet to file a return to file that return electronically, because we are able to process it. We did, as we opened various campuses around the country, we did shift physical mail from one campus to another when it was more of an ability to open based on health and safety in certain environments compared to others. So we were moving physical mail around the country to where we had the customer service representatives and others to process the mail. Similarly, we did the same thing electronically, but electronically, we could actually do it within 30 minutes, shift entirely from one campus to another. Physical mail requires trucks.
Yeah, I don't mean to cut you off.
Sorry.
Have all of the returns, say, filed by April 15th that went to Fresno, because if you're in Wisconsin, I think, you're supposed to mail to Fresno. They've been processed all as far as you know?
I will get back to you with specifics, but my understanding is we're already into July. So if somebody filed a paper return in March or April.
Good. I'll give you one more question because I'm running out of time. A lot has been said about people not being able to get these $1,200 checks. As I understand it, they were not supposed to go to people who were here illegally. Are you doing anything to make sure that those refunds are not going to people who are here illegally?
We have a series of filters and checks and markers that go into our system, which are based on the information that we have. We don't have complete information, as you can imagine, to every person, whether they're domestic or foreign, but based on the information we have, our systems are in line with the information that we have as to who should or shouldn't get payments.
Gentleman's time has expired. I thank the gentleman.
Thank you.
Congresswoman from the United States Virgin Islands, Ms. Plaskett, is recognized for her 5 minutes.
Thank you very much for the time, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. Mr. Reddick, just before I go into my line of questioning, I don't want to leave that hanging out there as if there is a perception on the part of IRS that you have given checks to illegal aliens, as they are being called. There is no reason to believe that the IRS are giving checks to individuals who have not filed income taxes and are therefore permanent residents and should be here lawfully. Is that correct?
To my knowledge, we've followed the law as the law is written. That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that. Let's not begin thinking that these stimulus checks are being given out willy-nilly and are not serving the purpose for which Congress intended them, that being to assist Americans and those who are qualified to receive them from receiving them. I wanted to ask you some questions with regard to how this funding is being, the COVID pandemic is panning out, and your tremendous support to the people of the territories and to the Virgin Islands. In September, I wrote a letter to you, Mr. Reddick, Commissioner, and to Secretary Mnuchin requesting temporary waiver of requirement that bona fide residents of the Virgin Islands be hospitalized in order to maintain physical presence in the territory for tax purposes on days that are spent on the mainland for medical reasons. As you know, due to our tax structure and for some individuals who utilize our economic development program and receive tax benefits for being in the Virgin Islands, they have a certain number of days that they have to reside in the territory. However, due to COVID pandemic, many of those are still on the mainland or have medical purposes. Do you have a response, or do you have any status request, status to give me on the update of my request to you?
It's my understanding that Treasury is responding and that response will be coming, I'd hate to use the term soon, but my understanding is soon. And let me say that if it's, we have followed up, we will follow up. And if soon is not in the space of less than 10 days, you'll hear from me or somebody on my behalf giving you a better timeline. But Treasury is handling the response to you.
Okay, thank you. In Washington, you hate to hear the word soon.
Yeah.
That's the
Right.
kind of word that I give my kids when I say, maybe you can go somewhere.
You heard my apprehension to it, I'm sure.
Thank you. I also wanted to find out, we had a terrible situation. IRS, you and Treasury were so good to support us in terms of when our governors gave you the number of individuals that were going to be receiving stimulus checks. Rather than seeking reimbursement for the money under the MIRA code, you gave money up front, and that has been really helpful to us based on those numbers. However, you may be aware that there was a snafu that occurred in that primarily those individuals who received Social Security checks were given 2 checks, one from Puerto Rico in form of a direct deposit and the Virgin Islands. Many of these are elderly people. Some of them rely solely on Social Security, and they're really concerned because they've been told to write a check to the government of the Virgin Islands for the money that may have come from Puerto Rico, and the government of the Virgin Islands will then send that money to Puerto Rico for the double payments. The people are concerned that Puerto Rico will still in turn come after them, that money hasn't been sent. Are you aware of this issue, and is there any clarification on what the correct procedure is for those individuals who receive those checks to take care of that?
Specific as to the Virgin Islands, that came to my attention this week, and I also am understanding of a situation where essentially there's a concern that a person might issue a check but also have the same amount removed from their account, in which case they essentially received 0. Our intention is that every eligible American receive their payment and receive their payment in the correct amount. So I will actually personally look into that deeper. And as far as the advice, we do have advice for people who've received duplicate checks. And some of those issues are because we received information from multiple sources. We were trying to do as rapidly as possible. We did it to the best of our ability, but obviously there were situations where things happened, because of certain programs that couldn't work together maybe and things like that. But as far as that, there is a payment provision on our site where people can send checks. As far as sending them to the Virgin Islands folks sending it to Puerto Rico, I need to look into that because I'm not sure personally of that connection. We do have people there, but our intention, desire, and support is as strong for the people in the territories around the world as it is for people in downtown Washington, D.C., New York, or wherever. We understand the need and purpose of these payments, and we are trying our best. You will hear back from me, and if not, I encourage you to, again, reach out to me. Something you sent it forward yesterday did get on my desk, so
Okay.
you have the right channel.
Gentlelady's time has expired, but we'll take you at your word that you will get back to the gentlelady in terms of that inquiry. I thank the gentlelady. Gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Reddick, we had a hearing before the Oversight Committee, I don't know, a few years ago, and I asked then Commissioner Koskinen about a problem that Chairman Connolly brought up, and that is the tax gap. And I asked him why it is that we're failing to collect about $450 billion a year. And his response was the complexity of the tax code. I know our whole focus has been on the IT issue, and certainly that's a major issue, but isn't that part of the problem?
Complexity is always a problem. The tax gap is sort of multifaceted. It runs from guidance to a strong visible enforcement presence. It runs to information reporting with withholding. It runs to the ability for the IRS to require electronic filing of returns, which are obviously quicker for us to process than paper returns. A lot of issues with respect to tiered partnerships. We have ramped up over the course of the last year our Office of Fraud Enforcement, which is extremely visible. We've ramped up an Office of Promoter Investigations with respect to individuals who participate in certain abusive transactions. So trying to maintain a visible presence on that side. Our criminal investigation forces have been extremely visible.
Mr. Chairman, I need to move on.
Sorry.
I would like for you to respond to that in writing, if you don't mind, because I do think that's an issue. There's another issue that I would like to discuss, and it's something that I think the chairman has been supportive of, and that's our work on dealing with improper payments. And a lot of that has to do with technology issues in other agencies, including the IRS. One of the suggestions that I've made and we're trying to get into a legislative format to introduce is to allow agencies, as they reduce their improper payments, to take part of the funds that they save for use to modernize their IT systems. Is that something, Mr. Reddick, that you think would be helpful to the IRS?
The IRS is all in on issues that lead to funding for the Internal Revenue Service, assuming they're approved by Congress and appropriately appropriated.
Well, then my next question would be, with the realization that you've got these major IT issues, does the IRS have a modernization plan that has clearly defined objectives, an achievable schedule? Because there are issues that have been raised about the achievability of a schedule, and a realistic budget for replacing the IT systems. Because I've heard that some of these legacy systems still operate on the old COBOL system. Is that true? And do you have clearly defined objectives for modernizing your IT systems?
We do. We don't have hardware that goes back to the 60s, but we do have language that goes back to the 60s. And we have a modernization plan that was launched April of 2019. We also have modernization coming forth under the Taxpayer First Act. Both of those are running together but independent so that there's not overlap between those. And we'd be pleased to have our folks come up and do a briefing for you or for your staff, however it is appropriate, to show you exactly where we are and where we're headed.
Well, I want to get back to the funding for this. So I would propose that Congress amend the Payment Integrity Information Act to allow agencies to direct a portion of recovered improper payments into a fund for modernizing their IT systems. And this is not just an IRS problem, as I said earlier. It is throughout the federal government, and it includes some of the states as well. So I would like to, Mr. Chairman, work with the committee if we can in the time that's left in this Congress on an initiative like that. In the last few seconds that I have left, I'm going to go off topic here, but I do want to congratulate the Department of Justice, the FBI, and our intelligence services in the arrest today of Alexander Cotney and El Sheikh. These are the alleged kidnappers of James Foley, Peter Kasich, Stephen Sotloff, and Kayla Mueller. They are alleged to have kidnapped, tortured, and murdered these people. And while we've been in this hearing, it was announced that they've been arrested. And I hope this brings some peace and closure for those families who've been involved in that. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank my friend from Alabama, and I welcome his comments on the need to systematically develop a plan for modernizing the IRS and bringing it into 21st century technology. And I pledge to work with my good friend on developing such plans here in the subcommittee.
I know you mean that, and I thank the chairman.
I thank my friend. The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, is recognized for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Reddick, greetings. Last week, I sent you a bipartisan letter from more than 100 different members asking you to ensure that victims of domestic violence, rather than their abusers, get their stimulus checks. As you know, domestic violence has soared during the pandemic, but the IRS response has often been to tell abused spouses to get their money through a divorce settlement, which is callous and irresponsible. Will you establish a process for domestic abuse survivors to notify the IRS if their payment has been stolen away by their abuser? And will you issue catch-up payments to those who've had their payments stolen?
As tax administrator, we do not have the discretion to issue payments other than as provided in the CARES Act. The CARES Act requires the IRS to use tax return information to the extent we have it. So in the situation involving a domestic violence, if a joint return was filed, the IRS is required to issue, in that context, $2,400 plus $500 for if there's dependents, to the joint filers. And if there's banking information, it's required to be deposited into that account. The CARES Act does not provide the Internal Revenue Service with discretion to add an additional, say in this context, $1,200 to the victim of domestic violence. We, as people, are very sympathetic.
Excuse me, didn't the IRS Chief Counsel conclude in 2009 that if a stimulus payment is stolen or not received, the IRS can issue a replacement payment? Why wouldn't that apply in this circumstance?
That's completely unrelated. If you'd like to get into specifics, we can do it, but some people are relying on the wrong issue there. When we make a payment into a joint account, the way that the statute requires us to make that payment, it goes into that joint account. What happens to it once the payment gets there? But we can work with you specifically. And
I wrote to Secretary Mnuchin on September 9th expressing concern about the president's plan to require federal employees to accept a payroll tax deferral. This move is a political ploy to make it seem as if federal employees are earning more money than they're actually earning, only to reach the end of the deferral period next year when suddenly they'll have a significant back tax payment. During a recent Senate hearing, I was encouraged to hear Secretary Mnuchin agree with my Senator, Chris Van Hollen, that it would be reasonable to give federal employees a choice in this matter. Mr. Reddick, do you agree with Secretary Mnuchin, and will the federal government indeed allow employees to opt out of this tax deferral? If not, why not?
the Internal Revenue Service is a bureau of the Department of Treasury, and I report to Secretary Mnuchin. So the way that he indicates for us to go on policy and other issues is the way the Internal Revenue Service will go.
All right. But my constituents have been calling to voice opposition to this plan. Federal employee groups are up in arms about it, and we should not be using federal workers as pawns. Ms. Collins, I'd like to turn to you. In April, you told me that your office could not help the public with certain EIP payment issues. You updated that guidance in August and announced you could help with some, but identified 4 categories where the office couldn't help. This includes if the EIP was determined based on the wrong tax year. Your response has been that those taxpayers will have to wait till sometime in 2021 to receive the money they're owed. That is baffling to me for funds that were intended to provide immediate relief in an emergency. Ms. Collins, why isn't your office advocating for people in that position?
We are advocating for those people, but the challenge we have is at the time the payments were issued, the IRS relied on the CARES Act, which said that they had an option to rely on their 2018 return if the 19 return wasn't filed. So the challenge these taxpayers have is the amount when it was issued was correct based on 18, but the 19 return, for example, someone had a child, so now they have a qualifying child, they're entitled to another $500. That would have to be manually processed by someone within the IRS. That's our challenge, is the IRS does not have enough staff to potentially do 3 million individual entries for those individuals. So we are continuing to advocate for those people, but I do understand the problems that the IRS has in working these cases. It's not something that they can automate. They would have to go through potentially 160 million returns to see what changed between the 2 years.
Mr. Reddick, let me ask you then, when will the IRS set up necessary procedures and processes to allow Ms. Collins to assist all taxpayers who have not yet received their EIP funds?
The gentleman's time has expired, but Mr. Reddick may respond.
We currently have 11,300 customer service representatives available on phones. Obviously, we get more calls than that, so we don't have the ability and the staffing to answer all the calls, but we are doing our best. And I can vouch for the fact that the taxpayer advocate has advocated for the issues presented. The Internal Revenue Service is in the scenario of needing to prioritize quite a few issues that, when looked at individually, clearly come across as an extreme high priority. And then when you look at it and you look at the volume of individuals in this country and provisions in the CARES Act, we have to prioritize those based on our resource availability. And we are doing our best, but we certainly, the CARES Act itself provided for a true-up of amounts based on 2020 filing, and that's where the language comes to filing the return in 2020. And on the comments about extending the portal date to November 21 from October 15, I would hope that folks would take to heart the fact of our announcement on that called into the fact that any further extension of that would jeopardize our ability to handle the 2021 filing season. We are really trying to be cognizant of many, many issues. So I thank you for the additional time, sir.
Thank you. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stube, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My questions are for Mr. Reddick. First, I want to thank you for your service to our country and for being here today, and also for your son's service to our nation in the armed services. It's been reported in the media, and GAO has provided information that the IRS sent more than $1.4 billion in payments to deceased or incarcerated individuals. I got a lot of people in my district who received checks whose family members were deceased, and a lot of people want to know how this could possibly happen. So that would be my first question: is how did that amount of money go to people who were deceased?
If you look at the stimulus payments that went out in 2008, you'll see that the process for payments to deceased individuals, and then Treasury looked at the specific issues on decedents about the third week in May, and determined that deceased individuals were not eligible to receive payments. And so from the third week of May forward, those payments did not occur, but those were calls made outside of the Internal Revenue Service. And the vast majority of those funds have been sent back, or payments not sent out, actually.
Okay, so that was my follow-up question, was how much of that, and what are you guys doing to recoup those funds?
I have the statistics. It would take me a moment to get to it, but I believe something on the order of and I'll get specifics, this is off the top of my head, but I think that something on the order of 1.1 billion of the 1.4 billion, or 800 million of the 1.1 billion, something along those orders have been either returned or not sent out. And so the net figure, I believe, is approximately 300 million.
Okay, yeah, if you can get me those exact numbers, I'd appreciate it at your convenience. What other changes has the IRS made to prevent improper payments of existing funds, or if there's future stimulus payments? Is there parameters in place to prevent that from going out?
Well, certainly there's lessons learned anytime an agency undertakes a massive responsibility like we did through the CARES Act and the issuance of these payments. And keep in mind, there were business provisions incorporated within the CARES Act as well that our folks were there. So we constantly monitor for lessons learned in terms of our ability, and if there was to be another round, I know there's been discussions, but if there was to be another round, we're confident that we are able to do so, and it shouldn't go unnoticed that we issued about 81 million payments for $147 billion within less than 2 weeks when the CARES Act was enacted, and that required substantial programming by us. So we're as prepared as we could be, but we are better prepared than we were the last time, and I think we did admirably the last time.
In your expertise and in your position, what specific legislative reforms do you think that Congress and this committee should be looking at?
Well, since 2011, every administration has proposed the program integrity cap, which is funds directed to enforcement. There's a pending this year, it's about $400 million for enforcement. And the last program integrity cap actually approved by Congress was in 2010. I think that's significant. In a lot of the areas, you know, in terms of like EITC payments, given the Internal Revenue Service, and this is congressional, correctable error authority would be substantial. It would lessen the burdens on individuals. Giving the Internal Revenue Service the ability to regulate return preparers would be substantial. Enhancing the requirements for electronic filing of forms would be substantial. Accelerating electronic filing of W-2 forms to the Internal Revenue Service would be substantial. There's a lot of issues that would come together to assist us both from a guidance perspective as well as an enforcement perspective. And in my mind, those two go hand in hand. The person who's up late at night trying their best needs to understand what it is their requirements are, which is why we've gone wholesale into assisting people who either are not comfortable in the English language or do not speak English. We've also tried to simplify the languages. We've got Q codes on things that lead them directly to points on our website and such. But similarly, we've got to go out on the enforcement side and maintain a visible presence.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And if there's, if you could send those specifics that you just referenced, if you have more specifics and information on that to my office, I would love to look at those issues. Thank you for your time today, and my time's expired. Thanks for being here.
Thank the gentleman. The gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna, is recognized for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The IRS is responsible for collecting about $3.5 trillion in revenue. One of the things that I kept hearing from my constituents is why are people not getting the checks in time? Why is it taking so much time for the IRS to deliver stimulus checks or to process payments or collections? It turns out that the IRS is still reliant on legacy systems, some dating back all the way from the Kennedy administration. And in Silicon Valley, they just don't understand this. How is it that we haven't had software updates since then? And so, as you know, in 2019, the IRS paid almost $3 billion to operate its current information technology, and yet $2.3 billion of that was on legacy IT systems. Mr. D'Souza, could you describe the impact that the legacy IT systems have on the IRS's ability to deliver services to its taxpayers and fulfill its overall mission?
Sure, thank you. I'd be glad to. So I do want to make sure folks know that although the systems rely on older technology, the underlying hardware, much of it has been updated. But what the limitations are of using these older technologies is, one, most notably, it's hard to find staff that know these skills. Programmers today aren't coming out of school learning how to program in languages that are 50 years old. Secondly, it makes it harder for IRS to implement more online services because to the extent it can use contemporary technologies, it's easier for it to implement those. Relating to your point about the time it takes to do things, one of the biggest things that makes it easier for the IRS to do things more quickly is for people to do things electronically versus on paper. So we have issued work, for example, where we've identified recommendations for IRS to look at implementing more online services, and those kind of things will help speed things along.
And why did it take so long for the economic impact payments, the stimulus payments, to go out, and how is that connected to the IT systems?
So the vast majority of the payments did go out, I think, fairly quickly. I think any of the issues that we've talked about related to the payments had more to do with sort of policy and procedural issues versus the underlying technology, actually. I think the one outstanding issue is sort of identifying the remaining people who haven't been able to claim their payments and getting them access to the online portal that we've talked about.
How have the technology systems limited the ability to operate during the pandemic, and what are one or two main things you would recommend need to be changed?
Well, a lot of IRS's operations, sorry, let me back up a second. Many of IRS's employees do have the ability to work remotely already, but some of them didn't. So, for example, those in customer service positions, those obviously opening mail, you can't do that work remotely. To the extent that we can change work processes to allow more of those IRS folks to do work remotely, I think that would have longer term benefits beyond the pandemic. So that's a primary area for them to focus on.
Mr. Reddick, two questions for you. First, the CIO of the IRS does not report to you directly. Is that correct?
The CIO does not report directly, but I talk to the CIO at least once a week and many times 7 days a week. That's correct. But that's a provision that is in the Taxpayer First Act, and the IRS is being reorganized going forward. So I think you'll see that addressed.
That's good. And what do you think we need to do to modernize the IRS and to help deal with these legacy IT systems, and what is the plan to do that?
We actually have a plan independent of the Taxpayer First Act, and I think given the interest, I'm very familiar, I'm from California, very familiar with the Valley, and I have 3 brothers-in-law who are in IT in the Valley. So I'm understanding of, where IT is, let's say, in the Valley compared to where IT might be in terms of the Internal Revenue Service, and I have had visits up there. The Internal Revenue Service needs to come of age, and it needs to come of age to be able to serve the people of this country in a manner that the people of this country deserve to be served. I think that, universally, we all support that. And, we want the best for our people. We don't want a tax administrator that is behind the times. And so we have to earn that trust and respect through providing that information to them. I would welcome the opportunity for myself and others to meet with you or your staff to give you the details on the 2 separate plans. They're independent. There is no overlap, but because tax one came on the scene first, but we are looking at them somewhat jointly. But we have a modernization business plan that was launched April 2019. We have yet to receive the funding requested on an annual basis, but it's a 6-year plan for that. And then the Taxpayer First Act has modernization in it as well. But I think, as you're all familiar with, there are no funding appropriations associated with the Taxpayer First Act. We need both of those.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Pasquale, the gentleman from New Jersey, is recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome. Mr. Pasquale, you need to unmute yourself.
We okay now?
There you go.
Thank you. I want to thank you for this opportunity. And as chair of the Oversight Subcommittee of Ways and Means Committee, I am very interested in the IRS's operations. This pandemic and economic crisis has been brutally hard on a lot of our communities and constituents. We've heard some very, very good questions from both sides of the aisle today. There's still neighbors in our cities and towns without economic impact payments or the IRS refunds that could help make ends meet. So I'm pleased the commissioner is here to answer questions. It must be said that he's utterly ignored the Ways and Means Committee in the 116th Congress. Mr. Commissioner, how can the Congress and the American people be assured that the audits of the President's tax returns are being conducted in a fair and scrupulous way and without political interference? How can we be assured of that?
Sir, as you know, I cannot speak to specific matters as to any taxpayer as to whether or not issues perspective to a return, to an examination of a return, to what might be in the return, to what might be in the examination. Earlier, there was a reference with respect to a criminal investigation of an organization. That reference did not come from the Internal Revenue Service, and the information anywhere associated with that did not come from the Internal Revenue Service. I cannot confirm or deny that information. Every taxpayer in this country is assured a confidentiality and privacy with respect to their tax matters. So as you know, sir, I cannot, under 6103 and otherwise, I cannot speak to that.
I don't want to get into the debate about privacy. That was part of 6103 in the code. I understand that. Privacy is very critical to me. My record is my record. But the point of the matter is, it would seem that we put that aside when, under the investigation of Commissioner Lerner, I believe it was 10 taxpayers who belonged to certain organizations were made public without any apology because they found nothing wrong. So that answer is not acceptable. The recent revelations of the president's lifetime of tax abuse and malfeasance threatens public confidence in the IRS. I'm talking about the very legitimacy of our federal tax system. I'm not sure you understand or appreciate that, sir. To begin to restore this trust, you must fulfill the Ways and Means Committee's legally binding request for the president's tax returns, his business and personal tax returns under 6103F. You have been illegally withholding them for the last 500 and today 470 days, 547 days. will you lawfully fulfill Chairman Neal's request?
Sir, as you know, that issue is pending litigation, and it's not appropriate for me to discuss pending litigation, and we have made the committees aware of that.
Mr. Reddick, you admitted in a recent report that the IRS audits low-income taxpayers disproportionately over wealthy tax cheats because it's easier to pick on regular Americans. This is in part a funding issue, but this is also a leadership issue. Do you have an immediate plan to end this shameful disparity? I call it shameful.
That report is absolutely false. Let me repeat it for people who didn't hear it the first time. Absolutely false. For taxpayers who have more than $10 million in total positive income per year, we audit at the rate of 8.16%. For the EITC community, we audit at the rate of 1.129%. Those facts are in our data book that was issued for fiscal year 2019. So the earned income rate is 1.1%. Taxpayers over 10 million, it is 8.16%. Taxpayers over 5 million, it's about 4-point-something%. And taxpayers between 1 and 5 million, it's something on the order of about 3%. So those numbers are disparate. The issue with respect to the earned income tax is there's a $17 billion improper payment associated with that per year, that the IRS does all it can do to get those payments out to the individuals as rapidly as possible. 98% of the EITC payments are issued within 21 days. 2% get pulled for issues with respect to the fraud filters and ID theft and other issues that require a manual look by a person, and we process those in a priority fashion. So anybody who is going to assert that the Internal Revenue Service is in any way insensitive to any lower income, ethnic community, geographically diverse community, rural community, is absolutely wrong, and that should never come up. Those comments taint the hard-working, dedicated career employees of the Internal Revenue Service who create our audit plans, and that is not what the Internal Revenue Service is about. And I take, obviously, extreme discomfort in anybody asserting the contrary, and we would meet with any and every of you to go through that in detail.
The gentleman's time has expired. Let me just say, on behalf of Mr. Pascrell, I think the question was not to disparage the IRS, it was to ascertain whether reports about a discrepancy between the percentage of audits of people receiving the EITC was on par with the percentage of audits of people making more than or reporting more than $10 million of disposable income. You have vigorously denied that report.
I respect Congressman Pascrell. There is chatter outside of our buildings that implicate what I'm there for, or implicate where I went with respect to that, and it's unacceptable to the IRS.
I understand that, but it's not unacceptable for a distinguished member of Congress from the Ways and Means Committee waived onto this subcommittee to ask that question.
No, sir, and I agree, and I said I respect Congressman Pascrell considerably, and I appreciate his question.
Well, good. Then we are in agreement on that. We both respect Mr. Pascrell. Thank you, Mr. Pascrell, for joining us. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Porter, for her 5 minutes.
Commissioner Reding, we're going to start with some simple yes or no questions, just to keep this moving. You have a responsibility to remain impartial and unbiased in your role as IRS Commissioner, correct?
Correct.
And as IRS Commissioner, do you believe that it's important to hold criminals accountable for tax fraud, evasion, or other violations of the tax code?
If this is, the Internal Revenue Service has a very aggressive criminal investigation service.
Mr. Reding, let me make sure you can hear me.
I am having difficulty hearing you, ma'am.
Okay. As IRS Commissioner, do you believe it is important to hold criminals accountable for tax fraud, evasion, and other violations of the tax code?
The enforcement efforts.
Yes or no?
The enforcement efforts of the Internal Revenue Service are there to pursue those who do not comply with the tax laws.
Reclaiming my time. Ms. Commissioner Redding, I'm not trying to be difficult here. Do you believe in holding criminals accountable? Yes or no?
That's what criminal investigation of the Internal Revenue Service does. Actually, we investigate, we do not prosecute.
And holding those criminals accountable through investigation stems from your sworn commitment to upholding the Constitution, correct?
That's correct.
I ask that because in addition to the salary you receive as an IRS commissioner, you also earn between $100,000 and $200,000 per year from your ownership of 2 units at Trump International, Waikiki. You have continued to earn this additional income while in office, correct? Yes or no?
Correct, and all of that was approved before I came on board and each year by the ethics officials of the Internal Revenue Service and other agencies, ma'am.
Mr. Redding, did you disclose that information to the Senate Finance Committee when you were nominated for the position?
Absolutely, and anybody who asserts in any way, shape, or form that there was a concealment is absolutely wrong. During my confirmation process, the Senate committee received over 80 pages of invoices that specifically identified that property. The instructions for that property specifically say to put the city and state where all properties are located. That is exactly what transpired with respect to those properties and other properties that I own. And anybody who asserts to the contrary really does not know what they're talking about or the process.
Okay, Commissioner Redding, there is no need to get upset.
Ma'am, I've been dealing with that since I
me.
came on board, and I do not take lightly anybody trying to disparage my reputation or my family's reputation.
Commissioner Redding, I do not take lightly people attacking the members of this committee.
I
who are
do
simply
not
trying
intend
to get
to attack you, and if so, if it was received like that, I apologize to you and others.
The gentlelady controls the time.
To the gentlelady. Mr. Chairman,
Ms. Porter.
the time belongs to me. Mr. Redding, since you're getting upset about that line of questioning, I'd like to try another one. How many economic impact payments, how many people are still waiting on their economic impact payments?
First, let me apologize to you if you took that as an attack, ma'am. I have to indicate that that issue has been out there, and if it came across as hostile or aggressive towards you, I do apologize. That is not who I am, and I certainly would not imply that to you or other members of the committee. So I would hope that you would accept my apology with respect to that. With respect to individuals and payments that we are struggling to issue, it's very difficult for us to identify people who do not interact with the government, with the Internal Revenue Service, with the homeless shelters and whatnot. We don't have a figure for you. I have been asked earlier today to provide a figure. I can tell you we're currently...
Let me reclaim my time here. It's about 9 million. And since you said that some of these people haven't reached out to the government, I just want to share our experience in our office, where we have had 114 people reach out, 114 constituents in my district alone. And we have worked tirelessly, our casework team, to get answers for those people for months and months and months. At this point, we have answers for 13 of them. That is, as you know, 11%. So these other people, we have no information. 50 cases of these 114, we have not been able to get any response at all from the IRS. So I would respectfully ask you to please communicate with your team about responding in a timely way to congressional inquiries, because for every American who is reaching out to our office and is asking for help, one, we're not able to get them help because the IRS doesn't respond to us in almost half the cases. And two, for every American who does reach out to us, there are literally hundreds of thousands of more who are just waiting and don't have that information. So I would really appreciate your going back to your team and getting the committee a clear answer of the estimated number of people who have not received economic impact payments who are waiting, and how many outstanding and unresponded to congressional inquiries you have on both sides of the aisle. Thank you very much. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. And let me just say to Ms. Porter, before she joined the hearing, I made the same point, that there are a number of constituents in all of our respective offices who have not heard, who have confused instructions, have not received payments, and we represent those constituents. And the numbers you've shown are probably reflective of so many of us. And I might add, it's a bipartisan issue. Mr. Heiss, the ranking member, made the same point about his constituency in Georgia. And what the chair asked Mr. Reddick to do was to go back and look at the liaison functions with members of Congress, because when somebody contacts our office, it means everything else has failed. And so we've got to have more responsive reactions from the IRS. And Mr. Reddick, I would say, Ms. Porter, I believe committed to doing just that. And we will follow up on that. But Ms. Porter raises a very good issue, and it is, I think, universally shared by members of Congress. Thank you, Ms. Porter, for bringing that up and using that handy-dandy whiteboard you're so adept at. Thank you.
And once again, Congresswoman, I do apologize if it was received as hostile, but it's obviously a personal issue. So thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes.
Chairman, can I interrupt for 1 sec?
Yes, of course, Ms. Collins.
I just wanted to point out, you had talked about a liaison and an ombudsman. That is what we do. That is what our function is, that Congress created the National Taxpayer Advocate solely for that purpose. So our local offices do have contacts with various staff members, and we're happy to help on all these cases that we can help intervene.
And we appreciate that. But when a member of Congress calls a federal agency that falls under our purview, I expect an answer, not through a third party, directly. When I write a letter, I expect that letter to be answered. I think, for the record, I've presented a letter I sent 3 weeks ago that has not yet been responded to. And again, there's a certain urgency here. These aren't just idle thoughts coming from members of Congress. We're trying in real time to help constituents for whom, for whatever reason, the system has not worked. So you're quite right to remind us you're a resource and you're an asset that we should not overlook. But I think we were talking directly about communication with the agency and trying to get a better line of communication that works for everybody. Mr. Reddick, did you?
So we accept that. The taxpayer advocate is housed within the Internal Revenue Service, and we have a shared responsibility that when things come in through legislative affairs, certain items are automatically routed, certain items obviously are not. We accept and appreciate that we could do a better job. We will not give you excuses for staffing and funding and whatnot. I will only vouch for the dedication and desire of, I think, one of the most hardworking, dedicated workforces in the entire federal government.
We will stipulate that. But again, remember,
Appreciate it. I'll take that back, sir.
Yeah, we operate in real time too. And
sir, if you're not happy, we're not doing our job.
All right.
Leave
We
it at that.
understand each other. Now, my line of questioning, Mr. D'Souza, I'm going to give Mr. Reddick a little bit of a break. What do we know about the scope of the IT challenge at IRS? I mean, we talk in generalization about legacy systems. Do we know how many legacy systems there are?
I think we actually had a finding that IRS didn't have a complete inventory of its legacy systems, but I think, generally we do. I think that as we
can you give a number to that generally?
So I would have to get back to you.
Are we talking about hundreds of systems, dozens of systems? What?
I think on the order of hundreds.
Hundreds.
But part of the thing I guess to keep in mind is it depends a little bit on how the agency defines a system. So that's why I have to. I'll get back to you with a more exact number.
I would appreciate that. Mm-hmm. In fact, this subcommittee is going to formally request GAO for a comprehensive inventory of the scope of the problem and challenge. And by the way, what's wrong with a legacy system?
Well, as we discussed, they rely on older technology, and it can be harder to find people to employ to keep it up to date. You have a limited range of vendors that support that technology over time. If you're
but I'm more interested, that's all interesting.
Okay.
But I'm interested in how it affects capability. I mean, a system that's 40 years old does not have the same capability of handling the mass volume Mr. Reddick has to handle than a contemporary system. Is that correct?
So I would say that actually the IRS systems do handle a very large volume.
That wasn't my question. My question was, when you compare a legacy system's capability to a system we would deploy today, the former is inadequate compared to the latter.
It is, but it's not in terms of volume. It's probably in terms of capabilities it provides. We talked about the ability to provide services online, provide information more quickly to taxpayers.
Well, is it more costly to maintain?
Yes.
Yes. Any idea of what percentage of the IT budget Mr. Reddick oversees is devoted simply to maintaining legacy systems?
So 80% of the budget goes for ongoing operations. The exact percentage of that, that's for legacy systems. Again, I need to get back to you on that.
So what is your estimate of what it would cost to update completely the IT systems, both hardware and software, and retire these legacy systems at the IRS?
I don't have an exact number, but what I can say is that the modernization plans that we've talked about are good first steps, but they actually don't fully address what it would take to retire these legacy systems. One of the things we asked the acting CIO is whether or not they had a full plan to retire IMF, which is one of the biggest legacy systems, and they said they were working on that. I think over time they've taken various attempts at it, and they haven't been successful. So we'll have to see what.
Wait, Mr. D'Souza, that's not an adequate answer. They haven't been successful. Why have they not been successful? To what extent? This hearing is about resources for the IRS to make sure it is as responsive as it can be to the American people, and we've documented how they were starved of resources and in fact vilified by this very committee, I might add, for 10 years, at the cost of reinvestment. So how has this affected capability?
Sure. So as the budget for these modernization activities has been cut, or as we've had situations like a lapse in appropriations or continuing resolutions, IRS has continually had to replan and reprioritize its efforts. That takes time. It slows things down. They have to move staff around. If they don't have enough staff, then they have to triage and focus on high priority activities. They're not able to do certain things. One of the things we reported on, it indirectly answers your question, though, is with this most recent, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, IRS had to shift its IT resources to implement those changes versus some ongoing activities that it planned to do to enhance its systems. So those are all some examples of trade-offs the IRS has to make when it doesn't have resources.
You say trade-offs, somebody might use a different image, cannibalization. By the way, it's not just legacy systems, is it? I remember a few years ago when this committee was vilifying your predecessor, Mr. Koskinen, whom I consider an exemplary public servant, but nonetheless, members of this committee vilified Mr. Koskinen because of crashes with hard drives throughout the agency. And one of the things not discussed, of course, because that would have been inconvenient, was the age of the hardware we were talking about. I mean, PCs. So in the private sector, when I was in the private sector for 20 years, we kind of replaced our PCs about every 3 years. What is the replacement rate? What is the age and replacement rate of PCs for IRS employees currently?
So I don't have a current rate. What I can say is when we did look at this issue a few years ago, we found that the majority of IRS IT equipment was outdated. Since that time, we do know
Mr. D'Souza, outdated. How many years? How old?
Again, I'd have to get back to you with the specifics on that.
Mr. Reddick, do you know?
We're making, to the extent we get funding, we're making real inroads into updating our systems. Most of our systems are far beyond their useful life, and we have, for most of those systems, we have extended the useful life on things that you have like laptops and such. So we extend the useful life with warranties and whatnot, and then we end up having to go beyond that because we don't have the ability to replace. One comment just quickly on terms of efficiency as we were to update our systems, something that has always stayed in my head, and it's pretty simple, is as we modernize and we bring in chat bots for people who call in, one employee can handle one telephone call, but one employee can handle 4 chat bots at the same time. So that's a 4-to-1 leverage. We have 11,500 customer service representatives. In theory, if it was direct math, you would put us up to 40,000 by getting us there. Our ability to leverage resources through a modernized system, which includes both language, it includes software, it includes hardware, would be greatly received by every employee of the Internal Revenue Service, as well as, I think, by every American.
I mean, let me just say, Mr. D'Souza, we need more from GAO than what we got here. We need a comprehensive inventory of the nature of the IT systems, legacy systems, hardware, software, Zoom capabilities, whatever, so that we understand the scope of the problem, and we need dollar figures assigned to that so we understand the investments that are going to be required. The other thing we need is an assessment from you, and with cooperation with the IRS, what's the return on investment? I mean, we talk about GAO, the agency for which you work, that roughly every dollar we invest in GAO, we get at least an $8 or $11 return. Well, what's the comparable figure for IRS? If IRS can do double the audits it does currently, presumably the return on that is quite considerable, especially when we know at least $450 billion is left on the table, taxes owed but not paid because of capability of auditing, tracing, collecting, enforcing. And so those are important considerations. In addition to, we're in a pandemic. And while I think Mr. Reddick and Ms. Collins have both indicated that they've done a very credible job in trying to respond under the most adverse circumstances with a history of disinvestment for 10 years, nonetheless, we know things are on the table. With all of that, we know that millions of Americans still haven't gotten their direct payment. Millions of Americans are still complaining about a responsiveness from IRS in terms of refunds or filing or processing a claim or making an appeal or dealing with an audit. So the relationship between the investment in IT and the capability of the IRS to do its job on behalf of the American people, and by the way, part of its job, because of voluntary compliance, which is so high in America compared to other places, is based on the fact that I perceive the system to be fair, that it's going to treat me the same way it treats anybody else, rich or poor. They're going to hold that person and me accountable. And if that trust is damaged, compliance will fall. And that will hurt the ability of the United States government to fund itself and the services it provides people, especially during this period of time, which is so challenging. So we need the GAO to really look more closely and provide us with more comprehensive data in terms of the scope of the problem and what it will take to address that problem.
We do have work underway that's looking at some of these issues, and we'll be glad to update your staff on that.
Well, we want you to expand that so that it's not some of these issues, it's everything we've just described. That's why we're having this hearing. And we need GAO as a resource to help us understand the analytics and the boundaries of those analytics. Yes, Mr. Reddick.
We obviously will cooperate with GAO in that regard. And I just wanted to add on one thing about the compliance side of the house. We look at service and compliance together. We look at the desire of the IRS to earn the trust and respect of every American. When I made the comments about getting into different languages, lower income communities, expanding VITA resources, expanding resources to low income taxpayer clinics, when you consider that fiscal 19, our gross receipts were $3.56 trillion, which is 96% of the gross receipts of the United States of America, and that the, per the tax gap, the voluntary compliance rate hovers around 83%, and that's for Americans who timely file and pay, essentially, and maintain compliance. If we can help the folks who are trying to get it on their own by in language, simple language, understandable things, open up those avenues, answer the phones when they place those calls, and we were only to bump the voluntary compliance rate 1%, sir. That's $35 billion a year from Americans who want to get it right, who are proud to be Americans, who are proud to file tax returns. And there's a lot of people there. This is the first time, to my knowledge, in the history of the Internal Revenue Service that we've done such an expansion into languages. I'm very proud to be the son of an immigrant and the husband of an immigrant, very respectful for the challenges people have who come here, and it's incumbent upon us, collectively, sir, to make sure they have the ability to get it right. Modernization helps us significantly in that regard. It also helps our enforcement component. So we welcome the assistance of Congress.
Well, thank you. And the fact that you are the son of immigrants, I'm a grandson of an immigrant, and you married a refugee, I think just gives living proof to the fact that immigration rewards and enriches America. It doesn't detract from it. And by the way, with respect to refugees, I will just say editorially, curbing the number of refugees, people fleeing violence, is a very un-American thing from this member's point of view, and we ought to be doing exactly the opposite, opening our welcoming arms to people who are suffering violence and persecution abroad. That's what refugee means, and that's what the refugee program is designed to provide.
Sir, to help you with perspective, my wife was born and raised in Vietnam. After the fall of Vietnam, April 30, 1975, her father was taken away to a re-education camp for 3 years, 9 months. She, in 1982, fled by boat. She's a boat person, for the term. I don't mean it in a derogatory sense. I'm hugely proud of her.
Sure.
And
as you should be. And
rescued at sea.
And that's the story of America.
Exactly.
I know we're digressing, but the idea that we would cap the number of refugees who perhaps worldwide are now at a record number at 15,000 is disgraceful and from my point of view, un-American. At any rate, on to IRS. We need more progress. We need more help from GAO in broadening the scope. Mr. D'Souza, we'll be glad to work with you and Mr. Dodaro on that. And Mr. Reddick, hopefully you and Ms. Collins, who's new in the job, will be creating mechanisms to be more responsive to congressional inquiries, because remember, we're also representing taxpayers, but taxpayers who have found, for whatever reason, the system doesn't work. With that, we have 5 days for additional questions that may be submitted to our witnesses, and we would ask for a speedy and expeditious response in writing should you get those questions through the chair. And with that, this hearing is concluded. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.